Broadcasting from Baltimore, Maryland, this is 5x3 Radio, where strength is for everyone. I'm your host, Emily Sokolinski, owner of 5x3 Training, a strength and conditioning gym in Baltimore, along with my co-host, Rebecca Fishburne, founder of Cornerstone Strength Maryland. Each week, Rebecca and I will discuss the ins and outs of strength training, why there is a no one-size-fits-all approach, and why strength is so important in our daily lives. Thanks for spending some time with us today. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to 5x3 Radio. Rebecca and I are here on this chilly Thursday afternoon, nearing the end of December. Goodness, I'm actually excited for 2024. I'm looking forward to the new year.
Okay, this is like totally geeky, but like the last day of this year, if you write it out numerically, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Think about
that's
it.
Freaky. Okay, that's freaky. Yeah. Do the research.
There you go.
2023 was okay. It was a good year. I mean, we're slowly climbing out of the COVID days, even though COVID is still attacking my clients. And I've got a few down for the count right now, but it is what it is. This podcast probably is coming out in the New Year's. This is our first podcast of 2024. So we hope everybody had a wonderful holiday and a wonderful new year. Because we're going to be putting this out in the new. So I'm wishing everybody that now. We thought we would discuss a topic, and actually I'm going to have Rebecca discuss a topic, and I'm going to be asking her questions that we have not talked about during the time that we've been on the podcast. And we'll point out that neither Rebecca nor I are physicians, of course. We're not doctors. We're not. But Rebecca has done a course. Is it a course, or is that right?
So it was a course that was called Pregnancy and Postpartum Corrective Exercise Specialist, and it's a course that's put together by a physical therapist who basically specializes in pelvic floor health.
Yeah. So we thought we'd talk today and have Rebecca actually lead the conversation on pelvic floor health, focusing on incontinence, which has been a topic that she's familiar with more than I'm familiar with, which I think is what I led you, I'm assuming, to kind of look more into it and take some courses on it, because I know I've had women come to me and ask me questions about their pelvic floor, and I actually have never experienced any issues myself during my lifting time, and so I always turn them over to Rebecca, and because I know that she's done the work on this.
I mean, you see a lot of times too, just if you're on, I don't know, particularly after her fives, there'll be comments here and there about, incontinence while lifting. And
right. I mean, I had a woman just recently, right, that this past summer before the strongman contest come to me, and she had a couple questions, and I said, I don't have an answer for you. I said, but I know who do. I know who does. And put her in touch with you. And I've done it a couple times, actually. I think I've given your email out to a few people. And I know that Catherine did a wonderful presentation on this subject at one of the Starting Strength conferences. But I don't think that video is up anymore. Yeah. But we could, she might have it. I could always contact her, and we could always put that on the show notes later on if I get the video of it, because it was a good presentation. So we thought we would take some time today to discuss what incontinence is and pelvic floor health in regards to lifting, and then I'm going to chime in with some questions. And of course, if you've got questions after you listen to this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. We could always do a follow-up podcast on it for anybody who's kind of dealing with this and would like to know a little bit more. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rebecca, and we'll start the discussion right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to start out, incontinence, like if that's not a term that you're familiar with, it's just leaking, right? Urinary leaking primarily is what you're talking about with incontinence. And there are a couple different types of incontinence that people might encounter. There's urge-induced incontinence. So that would be like that feeling that you've got to go to the bathroom, maybe when you don't even really need to go. And a way, sometimes you go and I mean, basically, if you have a full bladder, it's going to be like 1.5 to 2 cups of urine. So feeling like you need to go to the bathroom, but then just, just a little bit or a
Right.
dribble or
Right.
whatever. And that's often something that's related to habit. So you might have urge-induced incontinence, like I'm going to go get in the car, I'm going to go for a ride, I better do a just in caser, right? So you have this
Mhm.
sense that you've got to go pee, even though you really don't have to. Even though you don't have a full bladder. And that shows up sometimes in the gym because people sometimes feel like, okay, I'm going to do my heavy lift. I better run to the bathroom real quick first.
Right. Right.
So you might have people in a lift setting who are affected by urge-induced incontinence, but primarily, I think primarily what we're going to be talking about is stress-induced incontinence. So that's leakage without an urge, and it's often connected with exertion, lifting something heavy, or fatigue, right? So it can be related to either endurance or fatigue. So sometimes people will get stress-induced incontinence like at the end of a long run. So it's not something that strictly affects lifters. It can affect endurance athletes as well. Sometimes it can be stress induced based on sort of just a sudden unexpected event, right? And that can be something outside the gym also. It could be shouting to get someone's attention. It could be you're walking along and you misjudge the step down off the sidewalk, like you miss a step like that and you feel like you're falling, and that can cause incontinence for some people. And then it can also just be something that I guess might be more familiar to people who are doing starting strength type program, which would be like a max strength event or a really heavy lift. And I think, when we talked about this before, the idea was that sometimes it's something that people feel embarrassed about
Right.
talking about.
Right.
And I think, our goal here is to be able to talk about incontinence with the same kind of openness and honesty that I think a lot of the younger generation is taking towards their attitudes towards talking about their periods. Like the Period Project, or talking real honestly and openly about menstruation, to just be able to talk openly and honestly about incontinence without feeling embarrassed, without feeling ashamed. There's a lot of different things going on related to that, and we can take a look at like a whole bunch of different factors. But the idea being that incontinence is something that is pretty common,
Right.
but it's not necessarily normal.
And it's not just for women who have had children. I think that's kind of like sometimes it's like,
Yeah.
oh well, I haven't had kids. I shouldn't have to. I shouldn't have to worry about this, right? That's just women who were pregnant and have had children, and their pelvic floor is a little weaker because they had they had a kid. But that's not always the case. There's plenty of women who have never had children who have suffered from this, as well, and it can be embarrassing to discuss, but I think it's a very normal. It should be more normalized, like talking about your period. I mean, I discuss that with a lot of my ladies who are concerned when they're feeling weaker one week compared to the next, after in the month, and then they say to tell me that they're on their period. I said, well, you should make a note of that. Make a note of that in your logbook right now that this is occurring, so then we can start to modify your program as needed. So it does help to let people know that they can talk about this, that it's okay.
Yeah. And I think, I guess when this sort of first started to come up for me, like I was in a meet and I noticed that the lifter before me had experienced some incontinence. Like I went up to deadlift and there were a couple little dribbles on the floor.
Right.
And that was the first time it kind of even came up on my radar, like realizing that, and at that point, people were kind of talking quietly, like, oh, if you have, I have some pads, if you want to use like a period pad. So, that's one way that people kind of manage the situation when it's happening, but there's a lot of other stuff that can be discussed that might be a little bit more helpful in the long term. But like to your point, when you sort of pointed me towards Catherine, she had an interest in learning more about incontinence because she
Right.
was experiencing it, hadn't had any children,
Exactly.
was younger, like in her 20s. So sometimes people think, oh, this is just an issue, like you're saying, for women who've had children or people who are older. It can, affect anyone really.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
that's why it's important to, to have a discussion like this, because I think people don't recognize that maybe what they have, it can't be that. It can't be that because, they've never been pregnant. They're young, they're whatever it is, and to kind of know that, no, it can really affect it just about anybody.
yeah. And if you're,
it's, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and if you're doing strength lifting, if
Right.
you're doing
Right.
powerlifting and you are in an environment where you can't talk about it, or your coach isn't open to a discussion or doesn't have resources to point you towards,
Yeah. Yeah.
you want to maybe find some other resources. So,
Yeah, exactly. And I've often times, I mean, over the past couple of years, Catherine's video, like I said, her talk. I've turned people on to Girls Gone Strong, to Molly Galbraith and her website, because I know she's got a lot of discussion about that. Everything is focused on women. And then of course you as a source. So I myself, because that's something that have never been impacted by this. I can't really discuss it, but I'm glad I have resources to send women to. And
and you're
that's
also,
very open to discussing
yeah.
this too.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's the thing. And you're also very open to it. It's not like something that anybody in your gym experiencing incontinence ever would have felt like embarrassed or ashamed about. It was not a big deal.
Right.
So anyway,
Right.
so a lot of this information that I have, like I said, comes from this course that I took with Sarah Duvall, who's a physical therapist. So I just thought I'd start out with like a little bit of the anatomy. And she uses this term called abdominal canister, which basically just means your torso, right? So
Gotcha.
that can include a couple different components. So you've got all of those core muscles like your rectus abdominis, your internal obliques, your transverse abdominis. Then you've got your skeletal components like your spine and your pelvis, your diaphragm, your pelvic floor, and then all of the nerves and fascia. So all of that together, she refers to as the abdominal canister.
I like that.
I mean, I think most people might sort of think about that a little bit more just as torso. The function of all of that being like we talk about with lifting, to transfer force, to manage pressure, and also to provide stability for the spine, right? So those are sort of the three main jobs of your abdominal canister. And you, like with most things, right? Like when we talk about lifts, also, there's a lot of individual parts there, but they all work together as an integrated system.
Sure.
So sometimes it's helpful or useful to look at the parts individually or separately. And then it's also important to be able to think about the entire system as an integrated piece. And out of that, there's sort of a couple of aspects of that abdominal canister that I just thought would be helpful to take a closer look at.
Nice.
One being the diaphragm. And so a diaphragm really is just like a barrier, right? So if you think about diaphragm as barrier, like particularly a barrier that sort of separates or blocks off different body cavities like abdominal cavity or thoracic cavity, you've got three diaphragms in your body. So you've got your glottis, and we talk about that when you go to lift, you're going to, take a big held breath, you're going to block it off at the glottis,
Gotcha.
right? Like
Yep.
the back of your throat, right?
Yep.
So that's one of your three diaphragms. Then you've got your respiratory diaphragm, which is the one that people primarily think of when you say diaphragm, like that's actually its name.
Right. Right.
And then you've got the pelvic floor, right? So those are the three barriers that sort of establish your abdominal and thoracic cavities. And so I'm mentioning the diaphragm because the the respiratory diaphragm, I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a bit. And then also just a little bit in regards to the pelvic floor, because it is one of your core muscles.
Right.
And a lot of times when people think about training their core muscles, that's not on their radar. Although I did just have this article show up on my news feed, like in the last several weeks, where it was like, oh, the pelvic floor, the oft forgotten core muscle, and I think that article is kind of, did you get something like that on your news
I didn't
feed?
see that. No, I didn't see that. But
Yeah.
I do talk about, I mean, I don't talk about the pelvic floor per se, but when I talk about the core, and I always do the core in quotes, I remind people your core is not just your abdominals, but it's your entire trunk, right? Your hips, shoulders, like the entire like rectangle, all of that is what you want to think about when you're squatting, when you're deadlifting, when that is essential. So you can't just think about, oh, it's just my abs. That's it sends a wrong message to the rest of your body. It's like, oh wait, we don't count. Like we're just, we're buckets over here. But I think people mistake the fact that like they can separate themselves into these parts. And it's like, no, we all work together.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, that's the thing, right? Like we like to separate ourselves into parts, right? Especially people who like to do bodybuilding.
Sure.
And that's the whole, you go to a gym and you do the machines and it's got your body all separated down into separate parts and not really thinking about how you function as an integrated whole.
Right.
So yeah, like you're talking about your trunk, your torso, your abdominal canister, all the same thing.
I like that idea.
All of those pieces. Make up that whole. So the pelvic floor is part of your core. It's part of your core muscles, and it's one of the main stabilizers for your spine and your pelvis. So it needs to be involved when you're bracing and trying to keep everything locked in so that you can do a good squat or do a good deadlift or whatever. Right. Pelvic floor helps to manage your intra-abdominal pressure. It modulates the stiffness of your SI joint, contributes to your good posture and good respiratory function. And then it prevents leaks, and it also supports all of your pelvic organs, right? So we're focusing primarily on the pelvic floor health in terms of preventing like leaks and incontinence,
right.
But it's also significant and important in terms of keeping your pelvic organs in place so that you don't experience prolapse, which is something that would, come up on someone's radar a little bit more probably after they've had a kid, although that's not the only way that could affect someone's life.
Yeah, I know that we're not discussing this per se, but I was thinking about hemorrhoids too, just to kind of throw that in the mix, that like, it's not just, the front of you, but also behind you. That there's, that's you have to think about the whole, there's a lot of parts that you're focusing on, right? And there can be pressure when you build up enough pressure, certain things can occur. And that's, I'm kind of like jumping ahead, but leading down the road, Rebecca's going to discuss some things to consider, if this is something you deal with, and how to take care of yourself and how to deal with it in the weight room. And I think hemorrhoids is also kind of part of that too, because many people will have that as an issue. And how do they deal with that in regards to lifting and monitoring their own, own health?
And I think there's a lot of, helpful crossover.
Exactly.
So I think, sort of the way I was envisioning this, this conversation was sort of to take a look at what I think women traditionally were told in terms of incontinence, provide a couple more helpful suggestions than some of that traditional advice, and then also take a look at some additional considerations like belts specifically for weightlifting. So I think, a lot of times, even one of my friends who's a pediatrician, when she, about my age, so like early 50s, she was telling me when she was in medical school, basically they were told that, women probably really wouldn't or shouldn't be able to lift heavy for these sorts of reasons, right? That they would experience prolapse or they would experience incontinence, and it wasn't good for their pelvic floor or, that sort of thing. So one piece of advice that a lot of times people will get if they are experiencing, women in particular, if they're experiencing incontinence, is just to discourage them from lifting or
Mhm.
discourage them from particularly from lifting heavy. And that's not particularly helpful because people who live in this world of strength training understand that strength helps with everything. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, and if you're trying to keep your pelvic floor strong, being strong is going
Yes.
to be useful.
Yes.
So that's one piece of advice that's not particularly helpful that a lot of times people are given. And then the other is probably like just a blanket prescription for Kegel exercises.
Right.
So lots of people hear about that. And that's not necessarily the right approach for everyone because your pelvic floor, just like any other muscle in your system, can be hypertonic or hypotonic, right?
Mm.
So hypertonic means that it's always tight, right?
Mhm.
So like a lot of times people who get, stressed out and they have their shoulders jacked up into their ears, right? They've
Right.
got hypertonic traps. Like those muscles are always pulling up and into their ears. That's a place where people store a lot of stress.
Mhm.
Similarly with hip musculature and the pelvic floor, a lot of people store stress there and just clench.
Sure.
So for somebody who's got like a hypertonic pelvic floor, one that is always tight, or they're always, kind of squeezing,
Mhm.
that's not going to be helpful to tell them to squeeze more because just like with any muscle, if you contract it
Right.
um, too much and never let it relax and you
Right.
never let it fully relax, then it will give way on you.
Mhm.
So on the other side of the spectrum, you could have somebody who is hypotonic, meaning that their muscle tone is always lax. There's a lot of it's just relaxed laxity in
Mhm.
the pelvic floor. For someone like that, a proper Kegel could help. But just like we're talking about like fully relaxing, a lot of times people aren't told or taught how to do a proper Kegel, and they think
Mhm.
they just need to squeeze and hold really tight for an indeterminate amount of time. But if you're not squeezing and then fully relaxing afterwards, that is not a proper Kegel. You're just holding on to that tightness.
Gotcha.
And then you're going to get to that point where the muscle not having fully relaxed will just sort of give way after a while anyway.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
upper Kegels can be helpful, but not for everyone. And so some of that is, people who have really a lot of pelvic floor issues might go to see a pelvic floor physical therapist
Mhm.
who can help them identify, which category they fall into. But just with some awareness and some education, a lot of times women can just sort of figure that out for themselves, which camp they fall into.
Sure.
And then, and so, I mean, that stuff is all kind of familiar, I
Yeah, I
guess.
actually have a client who did go see a pelvic floor specialist.
Mhm.
That and told me they were in physical therapy, and I was like, physical therapy for what? And she said, oh, for
Yeah.
pelvic floor dysfunction. I
Yeah.
said, oh, wow, and it helped.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you go to see a pelvic floor physical therapist, that's sometimes going to be pretty hands-on.
yeah.
They will manually release a hypertonic pelvic floor.
Mm, mm.
Um, and so that's a whole lot of other stuff I know nothing about, but like for people who have real, real severe or pronounced issues, there are people who specialize in that.
So let me ask you, in what you learned
Mhm.
in your course, how you do you yourself kind of come to the realization that you've got some type of incontinence, that you have some type of dysfunction, that something doesn't feel quite right? Is it do you what I'm just wondering what would kind of make you more aware of what's going on in your body?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess for most people, if they're experiencing incontinence, they're going to have some kind of leakage.
Just
That's going to
leakage,
be,
right?
yeah. I think,
It's like a period of
what,
time that it becomes kind of more like it's a daily, like maybe it starts off like every other day, every couple days, and then becomes kind of more daily. Then it becomes something that happens quite often before going to the bathroom, or even then, and even after. I mean, is it?
I
I'm
think it
just
can vary.
okay.
I think it can manifest differently for different people, and depending on their circumstances and
Yeah.
depending on some other factors. And I think recognizing that incontinence is an issue for you is something that just, would take awareness. If there's not, I mean, like you can have leakage just a little bit or a lot. And as you build awareness, I think you notice even if you're having issues managing pressure before leakage becomes an issue. So like I was going to sort of cover about 5 different suggestions that I think are more helpful besides just, oh, everybody go Kegel and everybody stop lifting heavy. And pressure management and awareness, just general awareness are sort of among those suggestions. So like one of the very most helpful things that a person can learn to do is, and I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, but one of the most helpful things a person can do is learn to do proper 360 breathing. So that's like the air and the pressure in that abdominal canister, right? So 360 breathing and increasing your awareness of how you are, moving air through the system, air in the system. Another really seems crazy, but like just relaxing your glutes can be really helpful for people. Like a lot of times people just don't have a lot of body awareness and they confuse squeezing their glutes with squeezing their pelvic floor. And so which is funny to me because you and I probably have heard the term glute amnesia, like where people sit so much that they forget how to use their glutes. You ask them to squat and they only know how to bend their knees. They don't know how to. But, when people are then not really in tune with their body and they're trying to squeeze their pelvic floor, a lot of times glutes get mistaken or confused for that. And so tight glutes or squeezing. So being able to release the glutes, relax the glutes, allows the pelvic floor to function a little bit better. Working on posture and correcting alignment is going to help with just optimal functioning with everything. So I'm going to talk a lot more about breathing in a little bit, but if you think about just if you're slumped over and you're trying to get a good deep 360 breath, it's going to be a lot harder if your posture is all screwed up and you're slumped over. There's something called the knack maneuver, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And then also strengthening. Right? So the kind of the exact opposite of some of this traditional advice to avoid lifting.
Yeah, I before you move on, I just want to jump in and say yes to that, because I have a client who's older, right? She's in her, she's late decades. And she's in her 80s, and she just started doing strength work with me, and it's not lifting heavy. It's not, but it's heavy enough, and it's movement for her that she's not used to. And she told me that she typically would, when she would go to the bathroom, she would kind of pee a little bit before she'd even get to the bathroom, right? And now she finds that she doesn't. That she's able to, she gets to the bathroom and she hasn't peed before she's gone, and she can only attribute that to the exercises that she started doing, overall strengthening, just the squatting she's doing, this, the deadlifting she's doing, that overall over the time she has strengthened enough that she can control her body more and better. And so it's like, it sounds kind of, wrong to say to somebody, oh, you better not do any kind of strength training because that's going to make, and it's how you do it. It's what you do, obviously. And then it's learning more about your body and what you can and cannot do and how you kind of piece it all together. But that, that's a lot for some people. And it's easier just to kind of say, well, yep, better not do that. But now you're kind of defeating the purpose of what you probably could, potentially do for yourself. So one of the things about the 360 breathing that I think was really interesting in this course was learning. I mean, I didn't study kinesiology, anatomy, all of that. I was a English literature major. But when I explain this to people who are not in the medical field, it's still like, it boggles a lot of people's minds how the diaphragm works and how breathing works, because we think when we inhale that we're breathing and we're like,
like we have this misconception that what you're doing is like breathing with your lungs, filling up your lungs, like,
Right.
and
Right.
sometimes, that gets very confused for people, where what they're doing is basically shallow breathing, and breathing by like raising and lowering their shoulder girdle, all kinds of screwy things like that.
The
Um,
chipmunk cheeks, the breathing,
yeah,
the up
all
there, and
kinds of,
the
all
chipmunk
kinds
cheeks. Yeah.
of strange things. So the way breathing is actually meant to work is that when you inhale, your diaphragm contracts downward. So your
Mm-hmm.
diaphragm pushes down, which creates this negative pressure, this vacuum, sort of like the billows that you might use on a fireplace. And
Yeah.
that negative pressure is what fills the lungs with air. So the idea that you're breathing and the diaphragm presses down is kind of counterintuitive to the way a lot of people perceive breathing,
Yeah.
as something
Right.
where their chest is expanding, and they think it's something that's more upper
Suck in.
inhabited.
Suck in. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So when you're doing a proper breath, the diaphragm contracts downward, the pelvic floor also does. So they move together.
Right.
So a big inhale
Right.
will cause the respiratory diaphragm and the pelvic floor to contract downward. Then a good exhale, the diaphragm will rise back to its initial starting place, and the pelvic floor will also rise. So for people who are starting really just even at a baseline, just practicing that 360 breathing, where they're putting some, the pelvic floor contracts downward, and then working on that exhale where the pelvic floor rises, is a good place to start. And to think of that as when you're doing that breathing, sometimes it's really helpful to start just like doing that laying down, because there's like there a whole lot fewer distractions, but
Mm-hmm.
just kind of paying attention to the way your body moves as you're getting a big breath. I'm saying 360 because what's meant to happen is that pressure of the diaphragm contracting downward is meant to happen evenly, but a lot of people misperceive or misexecute the cue about belly breathing, and so they'll breathe into their belly, so the belly will dome up and then down. And so that's particularly problematic for women if they've had diastasis, right? So
Right.
the
The
abdominal split.
separation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not a belly breath, it's 360. It should be going like if you imagine your rib cage as an umbrella, like a
Mm-hmm.
closed umbrella, and you start to open the umbrella, the rib cage should expand outward the same way the bottom of that umbrella will start to expand outward all the way around 360.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who tend to belly breathe, if you're practicing this 360 breathing by laying down on the floor, you can kind of get that sensation of your ribs pressing into the mat behind you or something like that.
Yeah.
So that 360 breathing is a good place for a lot of people to start, because it's a good place for them to build general awareness about how their body typically functions, and then try and work on that even. It's about pressure management. It's all about pressure management. So if you're breathing in a way that puts a lot of pressure down onto your pelvic floor, like bearing down, that's not what you want. If you're breathing in
Right.
a way that puts a lot of pressure forward on your, your rectus abdominis, that's also not what you want. You want it to be even pressure all through your abdominal canister, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good place to kind of start. Like you're saying, how do you know? Like, how do you know without going to a pelvic floor specialist? Whether you're hypertonic or hypotonic, that's a good place to just sort of start building that awareness. And then from there, with the breathing, sometimes for people, a good next step for building the strength is like focusing on that exhale where the pelvic floor rises, learning how to get that pelvic floor rise, exhale, and brace at the same time, which is what we need to do when we're lifting. It should start with that pelvic floor rising and then bracing. So everything around gets solid, locked into a stable position. And they also have like breathing trainers, right, to help strengthen. So we talk about like progressively overloading. You can progressively overload the exhale, and for some people that is a helpful next step. And then I had mentioned also, okay, so you've got like the 360 breathing, building general awareness. Along with that, realizing that your pelvic floor is not your glutes. So relaxing the glutes, relaxing the pelvic floor when you need to, contracting the pelvic floor when you need to, good posture. So just thinking about like, if you're going to have optimal function, you want your ribs to be stacked up over your pelvis. You want to be standing tall. You don't want to be slumped over. I mentioned the knack maneuver, which is really just like a pre-contraction. So if you anticipate stress that will affect your pelvic floor, like you think you're going to sneeze or you think you're going to cough, you can do this sort of pre-contraction called a knack maneuver before that happens. And that sort of like contract, lifts, tightens the pelvic floor to help prevent incontinence or leakage. But in doing that, or in doing the sort of like how that would translate for lifting, you also need to be able to vary the intensity level of the pelvic floor contraction. Right. Because, like we were talking about before with a Kegel, if you're just squeezing hard all the time and you don't ever relax, yeah, then the muscle just gets like, it'll give way. You need to be able to, similar to, right, like to regulate the amount of pressure, regulate the amount of contraction, the same way that you would have to regulate the amount of force that you use when you're, say, like when you're deadlifting. Like if you're doing your warm up, you're going to apply a certain amount of force because you know that the bar is lighter. If you applied maximum force, like as if it were a 1 rep max, and you did that with your warm up, you'd tip over backwards, right? We sort of, without thinking about that, do that in regards to our lifting as we go through the warm up. And that should also translate to how we are able to contract and tighten the pelvic floor. So one of the analogies that Sarah Duvall used when she was explaining that concept was thinking about the pelvic floor and levels of the pelvic floor in terms of like an elevator, right? So if you're at resting, your pelvic floor is at resting, you're not really doing anything, you're not exerting yourself, that would be like the ground floor. Then you take an inhale, right? You inhale. So the diaphragm contracts downward, the pelvic floor moves downward. That's the basement. Then when you go to exhale, right? If it's just a regular exhale, the all of that's going to come back up to the ground floor, right? So it's coming back up to that. But there's sort of some additional levels to that. So that's just a regular relaxed breathing. Inhale, everything contracts downward into the basement. Exhale, everything relaxes back up to the ground floor. Sometimes you can inhale and bear down, press down, right? That's not something you want to be doing on a regular basis.
Yes. I was going to ask that question, like define between the why bearing down is not a good way of approaching like your breathing, like why you don't want to actually bear down. What's, what's
like if you're bearing down, and ideally you're not even doing that. Like sometimes people will think about bearing down as something that they have to do if they're trying to have a bowel movement. Ideally, you're not even doing that then. Ideally, you've had enough fiber and enough water in your daily diet.
Sometimes it happens.
Yeah. Okay. So, but like bearing down, like if you're thinking about this elevator thing, right? She talks about that as like, you're like pushing out the basement windows, right? That's not great. That's not healthy. It can lead to prolapse. People who have constant constipation can have issues with prolapse
Yeah.
just because
Yeah.
of the pressure.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like the additional level down to the basement. But then when you're talking about the exhale, when the pelvic floor starts to rise, and if you're actively contracting your pelvic floor, not just casually exhaling, where the pelvic floor just naturally rises up back to
Hmm.
the ground level. If you're actively contracting your pelvic floor because you're getting ready to do something that, ready to exert yourself, getting ready to lift or whatever, that's sort of more like it's rising up to from the ground floor to the first floor, to the second floor, to the third floor. So if you're doing your warm up and you've you've started your exhale, and the
Right.
pelvic floor is starting to contract and lift. If it's just a warm up, you're just gonna like contract and lift up to the first floor. If you're doing your 1 rep max, you want to be able to contract and lift the pelvic floor up to like the 8th floor, right? So
Gotcha.
being able to vary the
Right.
degree to
Right.
which you contract the pelvic floor is really an important thing to be able to do. And so she talks about that a lot of times, just in general life for people, that knack maneuver as something that you would do if you're getting ready to sneeze, or
Mhm.
even if you're if you're lifting, and it's all going to vary based on the task, based on the individual,
Right.
um, that sort of thing. But you need to be able to vary that level of contraction, and you need to be able to fully relax the pelvic floor when you're back down at that ground level. So that was, I thought, a helpful analogy for thinking about how to um, con- contract the pelvic floor and brace when you're getting ready to lift. When
Yeah. I mean, and for most people, I mean, I've had very, very few people and, in the gym. I mean, we've talked about it, and I didn't know that my other one of my clients was dealing with it, because I don't think she was dealing with it as far as like leaking at the gym. I would think it's just she was able to realize like just her daily life, what was going
Mhm.
on, but she's never mentioned it to me. But just about breathing, just getting people to understand how to breathe and how
Right,
to
yeah.
brace, and people who don't even have to deal with this, just teaching them what is actually going on when they take a breath. Because as we said, they'll get up here in their shoulders, they'll get chipmunk cheeks where they take the breath up here in their, in their mouth. And something as simple as telling them to, like, just think about ribs and belly button coming together. It makes it easier, because if you talk about, we're describing the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, like going through all that for somebody who needs to focus a little bit more on that is essential. For someone who just needs to learn how to kind of quickly brace,
Mhm. Yeah.
that 360 breath I've talked about before, just in terms of generalization, like you need to have breath completely around you, right? In the back and in the front, kind of giving a visual cue of like, you just need to try to keep all of this trunk as tight as possible. But the just in people learning how to breathe, how to take a breath and hold it. It comes eventually, I think, as people continue to
Yeah.
lift and have to really exhibit more internal, breathing to really brace themselves under a heavy load. But the idea of like the ribs coming together, the ribs down, the belly button coming, and the ribs coming together, is just that diaphragm in like what's going on inside the body, of the diaphragm kind of coming down and the pelvic floor coming up, and everything kind of getting tight in the middle. Because breathing is not easy for some people
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
learn how to do. It isn't. I don't think people
Or
really
to
think about it.
relearn,
Right, right.
how to
And
do.
people don't think about it. They don't think about it, and you can clearly see it because ribs pop out and and hips pop out, and you're like, okay,
And
let's
the shoulders go up into the ears, and yeah.
and then you talk about I don't know if you're going to get to this now or later. Talk about I guess when you talk about the belt
Oh,
and the
yeah.
need for a belt, and why having this issue, having a belt's not really going to help you. hold your breath better. It's
Yeah.
actually going to do the opposite.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
I guess like one of the things that you're saying too, though, right? Like you don't need, for a lot of people, you don't need to get down into the weeds about how to breathe. Like some
Right.
people can do it just fine. Some people have a lot of issues, like not breathing, up into their shoulders or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So like starting out, like you and I, if we're coaching someone, are just going to tell them basically take a deep breath and hold it, a
And
deep
hold it.
held breath,
Exactly.
and leave it
Exactly.
at that. And if they start to have more questions, or if they come to you initially with concerns about pelvic floor, then maybe you get into a little more detail. And we're kind of
Sure.
like that whole elevator thing and the variability of different contractions of pelvic floor and abdominals based on the task or based on the person is really just like we're getting a little more into the weeds about it because
Yes. You have
we're
to.
talking about how to have a more positive outcome if you've been
Exactly.
experiencing
Yeah.
incontinence. So being able to think about how you're doing that pelvic floor contraction, thinking about lifting and gathering the pelvic floor. If you need to have a really maximum effort pelvic floor contraction or really just maximum bracing for a heavy lift, that's going to be it's going to start with the pelvic floor lifting and gathering as you begin just the very beginning of that exhale, right? And then brace everything. And in order to have a max contraction, pelvic floor lifted and gathered, and your abs need to be, fully involved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some good drills that people can do to make sure they're activating their transverse abdominis and getting that inner layer of muscle, like that girdle, activated and tight to be prepared for, a maximum
Right.
effort
Right.
and making sure that, it's happening evenly around the whole abdominal canister. Right. So, yeah. And I guess, the strengthening, right? Just going ahead and strength training is always going to be helpful for a
Mm-hmm.
person, but properly progressing it.
Exactly.
And that I think is a place where, even though that's like one of the core tenets of starting strength, proper progression of the lifts, like you're progressively overloading the lifts. Sometimes we get to a point where we're doing something that's a lift that's really heavy, and that can, at a max effort, if depending on how a person is able to manage their intra-abdominal pressure,
Mm-hmm.
that is something that causes incontinence. And you want to think about that as the weak link in your system, the same
Mm-hmm.
way you think about it if you were squatting and your knees were caving, right? So you've
Right.
got knee valgus, that's the weak link in the system. Or
Right.
you're lifting and you're experiencing a lot of flexion, right? There's a weak link in the system. You don't just keep adding more weight.
Exactly.
You look at the
Address
programming,
it. Right.
you pull it back. And so if you are experiencing incontinence that is only showing up when you're doing your max lifts, think about that as like, the same way you would any other muscle in the whole integrated system.
Mm-hmm.
And you would
Mm-hmm.
pull your
Mm-hmm.
programming back to focus on strengthening that portion
Right.
or that bit of form, right? So you
Right.
would address a form issue, just kind of think of it as a form issue and start, readdressing the programming and properly progressing based on your pelvic floor being able to manage the amount of pressure needed to lift whatever
Mm-hmm.
the programmed weight is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that I mean, and that can be a tough thing because one of the people that you had reach out to me was just getting ready to do the strong woman competition. I
Yeah.
mean, sometimes you make choices, right?
Yeah.
Like if a person continues to lift for a period of time while they're experiencing incontinence, it's not like it's the end of the world, right? People have found ways to manage or deal or use a period pad or something like that, or depends, or something to absorb
Mm-hmm.
any leakage and then achieve whatever their lifting goal is, and then hopefully, ideally, after that, after they've achieved that goal, then think of that as being the weak link. And that's the place where a person's going to start to work to strengthen from that point. And that can be tough, like mentally.
Yeah. Yeah. Did Sarah address people who have this issue, but don't seem to let it kind of bother them, that they just continue to keep lifting or running or pushing, and then just deal with the fact that they're going to pee every time they do that? I asked that only because there's someone that I follow on Instagram. She's very, very strong, and she's talked about it considerably on her Instagram, and she lifts very, very heavy. She's extremely strong, but she's, I don't know, she doesn't really address it as much as she used to, but she will urinate right there. And she said she's tried this and she's tried that, and she just doesn't care anymore. It's just going to be what it's going to be. And she's doing what she wants to do, and she's healthy otherwise. Is that something that is healthy to think about? Or is it something that maybe in the long run, something's going to have to be done about it? I guess it's just more of like what choice you make, whether you want to.
I mean, I can't answer for her, but my sense after doing the course is, part of this like awareness that you're building for yourself, I think also is centered around what your goals are. Right. Mm-hmm. And so if you're, it sounds like you're talking about someone whose goal and self-definition is really tightly wound up with lifting heavy things, and who's just decided, fuck it. And okay, that's her choice. And that's fine. I think, really though, the approach that Sarah Duvall is sort of more stressing in this course is to think of the incontinence the same way you would any other, like if you had a muscle strain, right? Yeah. You could probably work through it. Sure. It might be fine. You might end up with a tear, right? Like you might end up with a muscle tear as opposed to just a strain. So, that's, if you're talking about maintaining a system that works as, an integrated whole, you probably want to address whatever the weak link is. But that's, again, where you need to have some thought about how that lines up with what your goals are. That's what I think. Yeah. Particularly if a person is getting ready for a competition, it's probably worth it to back burner the I mean, like you and I both know of people who have continued on through meets with like horrible injuries because they wanted to finish the meet. Sure. Right. Sure. After I did. That, most times they get some rehab and they work on addressing whatever the issue is. They don't continue lifting with that injury for the next year. And so it's not as bad as some of the injuries that, maybe we know of people having lifted through, which is why it's easy, I think, for a lot of people to just sort of ignore it or find ways to deal with it. But I think it's something that shouldn't be ignored. And I think that obviously because, people are dealing with this more and discussing it more, and there are more articles out there. There are more people to work with, their pelvic floor specialists, that it's something that can be addressed. And if you put the same attention into it as you would put into, recovering from a surgery on your knee, or recovering from, any kind of injury, a back tweak, you take the time to step back, you work on it, you address the issue, and then you slowly build back up. And and then you get past maybe a certain point, and you maybe something kind of rears its head again, and you have to backtrack a little bit. It's like anything. But if you just ignore it and let it think it's going to go away or push through it, it could lead to obviously, more issues down the road. So it's something that's not to be upset, no one's embarrassed when they hurt their knee or have knee surgery. So why would you be
ashamed or embarrassed that this is occurring. Your body is a whole, as you said, it works as a whole system. And when one part is not working properly, it should be, addressed, and find the best way to approach it for you and what you need. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, well, so anyway, yeah. I mean, I think she would probably encourage a person to address whatever the weakness is and build from there.
Sure.
As opposed to just pushing through. But that's not to say that's what everyone chooses.
Of course.
And that's not to say that they will necessarily encounter some horrible outcome because they made that choice.
Sure.
I mean, everybody's got a crystal ball, but
yeah.
So, yeah.
I was going to say, discuss the belt, because I'm curious to hear about the belt, because I know I have a lifter who's doesn't have incontinence, but has hemorrhoid issues and has not been using the belt, and because it does interfere with the hemorrhoids, and as a result, everything's staying as it should, right? There hasn't been any issues because the belt has not been used. And it's all about that. It was kind of a trial and error, right? Experiment. Like, oh, that really is the cause of this. So when I don't use the belt, everything stays, as is, and I don't have any issues, and everything's good. And as a result, has gotten, is strong enough that they can squat and deadlift beltless, whereas before they really needed it. So there's obviously good that's come out of it on both ends. I'm not having to worry about the belt and dealing with this, and also realizing, wow, my back is a lot stronger than it used to be. So
yeah. So I mean, the belt, like sometimes you can experiment with it and sort of find that whatever issue you're having, whether it's incontinence or hemorrhoids or whatever, isn't an issue if you're not using the belt. Basically, it comes down to pressure management.
Yes.
Right. So what a belt will do, right? And like somebody's puts a belt on and they're able to lift an extra 50 pounds that they weren't able to lift beltless. So it can allow a person to lift heavier weights, which, there's some benefits to that. But also, if what the belt is doing is allowing the person to increase their intra-abdominal pressure beyond the point at which their pelvic floor can manage it, that's when the belt becomes a problem. Right. So the belt might allow you to lift heavier, but if it is allowing you to increase the intra-abdominal pressure to the point where you're experiencing hemorrhoids or you're experiencing leakage, then same deal. That's the weak link in the system. It might not be the belt. It might be okay to use the belt, but just pull the weight back and build more gradually in terms of adding weight so that you can manage, your pelvic floor can manage the pressure that you're able to generate by using the belt. The other, so it allows them to kind of outpace what might be their slowest adapting muscle in the whole system. The other thing with a belt too, sometimes I think, is that it can actually apply physical pressure from the actual belt pressing into, and this is not maybe so much with hemorrhoids, but like with incontinence, depending on, the length of a person's torso, where the belt sits in relation to their bladder. Like, say, for instance, if a person is deadlifting and they experience some spinal flexion, the edge of the belt could actually physically be pressing into their bladder. And that additional physical pressure from the belt on the bladder might surpass a person's ability to withstand that, the pelvic floor to withstand that. So, I mean, I think, that those are sort of the main considerations with the belt. But just like you're saying, if it's good to be clear about what your goals are, and be willing to kind of experiment with some things, be willing to kind of pull the weight back and see if, using the belt at a lighter weight works, or if it's just getting rid of the belt in general. that, and again, if it's a person who's experiencing any of those issues like incontinence or hemorrhoids, but they are really committed to lifting heavy and competing, it might be a worthwhile trade-off for them. I mean,
Yeah.
for some
Yeah.
people it is, for some people it isn't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
Either is fine. We're all individuals.
It all depends. That's the word that always, it depends.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah, it depends. No, it does.
Ironically, is the name of the little
right.
the incontinence underwears.
So I want to ask you this. So you talked about going to the bathroom and feeling that you had the need to go to the bathroom. When you were lifting before, as you started to kind of be more aware of what was going on with you, and you would, and I've seen this with a lot of women, like, I got to go, let me go pee before I deadlift. Let me go pee before I put my belt on. That needing to do that because of afraid of what's going to happen, or that feeling, is that part of the kind of a growing concern? If you're constantly feeling like you need to, like, I need to pee before I lift, and going a couple times like during the session, because if you don't feel like you don't feel comfortable putting the belt on because you haven't gone to the bathroom and you're afraid of something happening. That's not always a good thing. I'm thinking.
Well, I mean, I think that's more like the urge-induced incontinence, right?
Yeah.
Like you build a habit, and then it's sort of like you're stuck in this habit loop. You have to kind of keep doing it. So it's a little bit different than the stress-induced incontinence, but I think you can see both. I mean, I definitely displayed both, and so I got to go in between every set of deadlifts. I'd do the heavy one, and then I'd pee before the heavy one, I'd pee after the heavy one, I'd pee in between the back offs, all of that. And that was more urge induced, right? And I think it can kind of get muddled up in a person's mind, their habits, and then the way the body behaves as a result of that. But I think, for me also, like, the belt actually pressing into my bladder was an issue. And then also just thinking about the pelvic floor as its own worthwhile muscle that needs to achieve a certain amount of strength, and respecting that as part of the whole system, and not just something that I was going to ignore. Like, I think, before COVID, when I was still lifting at the gym, like, I was sort of functioning along on that just described pattern. And now it's like, I'll lift in the basement, and I'll start at the beginning of my lift and be like, I probably have to pee, but whatever. And I'll go through all of my squat, all of my deadlift, come back upstairs an hour and 15 minutes later, and then, like, actually go.
Yeah. I think you're right.
A lot of that is like reconditioning my brain and my habits, but a lot of it also was like respecting the strength of my pelvic floor as a legitimate limit.
Right. I think that's different from, for anybody who's listening and thinking to myself, oh my God, well, when I'm nervous, I tend to go and pee like 1,000 times. I think that's something different, because I know for me, I'm at the gym. I may go to the bathroom at the end of my session. I usually never go, but during my session, whatever I'm doing. Part of it's because I have chalk on my hands, and I'm like, oh shit, if I wash my hands, then I got to wash the chalk off, and I got to chalk my hands again. But there's also just not that urge. There's just not that urge, even if I'm drinking a lot. But I know that when I perform, if I'm on stage performing, like in Nutcracker recently, or if I'm competing at a meet, then I have to go to the bathroom a lot. And that's just nerves. I think I feel like that's a whole different thing of, like, that is totally nerves.
Like, that's like urge induced. Like,
it's urge induced because I'm anxious. I'm anxious about, about competing. And once I get into it, it's like right before. And then once I'm in it, I'm done. It's the anticipation leading up to the actual event starting, or the actual dance performance starting. I definitely have to go. But then once I'm in it, I'm done. And it only happens at those kind of events, an event, or that's a stressor for me. Mentally. It's a mental stressor. They're mental stressors, not physical stressors. I mean, they are physical stressors when I start doing it, but I'm not stressed physically beforehand. I'm mentally stressed. So I think that's kind of something different, but I never, ever notice myself. I definitely never deadlifting. I've never noticed myself feeling an urge to go to the bathroom before I deadlift. And which is why it's so interesting to hear you talk about that, and and other people. And I see constantly running to the bathroom because they feel the urge, because they feel like uncomfortable when they're, and usually I guess because when they're bending over, you do feel uncomfortable, especially if you're in a belt, right? Everything's kind of pushing on each other. It's something I've never experienced before. So it's interesting to be able to listen to you talk about that. And I feel like I have a lot more just listening to you to discuss. And we've talked about it, but I have more now that I can share with people if they do ask me. And then if they ask me additional questions, I say, go see Rebecca.
Yeah.
But this has been good. And you might have, I think you might have more to talk about.
I have just two more suggestions. Like along with the 360 breathing and focusing on that and building awareness about how you are managing pressure within that abdominal canister. When you get that breath, you start a little bit of the exhale, the pelvic floor contracts, lifts, and then you brace to a varying degree depending on which level of the elevator you want to go to, based on the intensity of the lift. The other thing to pay attention to is to make sure that the muscles involved are firing evenly, right? Like we were just talking about, a lot of times people when they hold stress and tension in their neck and their shoulders, their traps will kind of hijack maneuvers. This same thing, and we were also talking about people holding tension in their pelvic floor or their hips or whatever. A lot of times, people are sometimes people will sort of, when they brace, grip their abs or their ribs, right? So it's like the external obliques get really tight and sort of act as a bully, taking over some of that work from the other muscles. So if you get those external obliques really gripping hard, that can exert pressure downward, right? So you want to have, so that's if somebody's trying to hold their belly in, or they're gripping their abs or their ribs, a lot of times that will create additional pressure downward on the pelvic floor. So making sure that not only is the breathing happening evenly throughout the torso or the trunk or the abdominal canister, but also that all of those muscles are working together in appropriate proportions, that you don't get one muscle group bullying the others or trying to take over some of the work. So that, another thing that you can just become more aware of in terms of how your own body works, and then address and see if that helps with any of these issues. And then the other thing to think about too is the barbell lifts, they're all sagittal plane, right? And so you're getting pretty strong in one plane of motion, but not a whole lot of stuff happening in the frontal plane. And having strong abductors can really help with pelvic floor issues. So adding some different movements into your training that include frontal plane movements like lateral lunges, monster walks, that sort of thing can also help. So those are just, some different non-traditional, don't lift and do Kegels, just do Kegels. Suggestions. And then, the only other thing that I was going to mention, because I guess it's getting pretty long.
we probably have done about an hour or so of a discussion, so we're probably wrapping up here.
The only other thing, a lot of we've been talking a lot about awareness, paying attention to how you breathe, paying attention to how your muscles are working as an integrated unit. Use your log, your training log. Make notes in there. Make notes about when you change things, how does that affect this issue? Are you having more pelvic floor issues? Track that and see, for a lot of people, there are connections between pelvic floor issues and hormone fluctuations. And those can be hormone fluctuations that are monthly. Those could be hormone fluctuations that are due to perimenopause or menopause. Track that so you've got a record. If it turns out that you're having more issues with incontinence on a regular cycle, you can adjust your programming.
Yep. Yep.
So, like we talked about, like pulling the weight back, maybe you put yourself on a 4-week cycle. And that, the week when you are most affected by hormone fluctuation and have the most issues with pelvic floor, with incontinence or whatever, that's not your max lift week. That's not your 1 rep max week. That's your rebuilding portion of your block, training block.
Yeah. That's, I think I mentioned, something like that earlier on as we started talking, that one of my ladies, is on her period, and she felt she just was so weak yesterday. And we pulled back. We pulled back some of the weight. We pulled back the weight on her squat, right? Because you could see she was already done with the bench. And I said, this is good. Make a note of this. Don't get frustrated. Make a note of this, because then we know, 4 weeks left, 4 weeks from now, as we come through this again, okay, this is what happened last time. Oh, it's deadlift day. We might want to, let's see how things feel as you start warming up. And it's like, it's not like, it's like anything that affects your body. Everything is, your body is, is affected in so many ways, right? Mentally, physically. So, and as women, she's an older woman, right? She's my age or so. So she's middle-aged. She's gone, she's probably perimenopause, menopausal too. There's a lot of changes happen in our, with our hormones. I definitely noticed that. I never noticed myself as far as like weaker or stronger. But I do make lots of notes and, about just what was going on one day to the next. And that gives you more information that will help you in the long run, because then you don't feel so frustrated every time something happens. You're like, well, I was so great last week, and this week I feel like crap. Well, what's going on? It's just like, oh, my knee was tweaked. I slept funny on my shoulders. My shoulder feels kind of funny today. Well, we'd adjust the program for that day too, or we'd warm up and see how we feel, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's something to
like you're talking about, sometimes there's things where it's just like you had a crap night's sleep, and so your lift suffers the next day.
There's that too.
And sometimes it's just random. But if you're tracking and you find out that there's a pattern to it, then you can avoid that frustration entirely by adjusting your programming. And it just feels better, like mentally, to be like, I'm still doing what's in my program, but it's because your program has taken into account what you have learned over the course of several months about how your body functions.
I don't think
you could have like a period one time where it's like you feel weaker, and it was a one-off because it was also in conjunction with, I don't know, like holiday stress, poor sleep, and you're coming down with
exactly
the cold.
All of that.
So if you track it, it happens again the next month, and then the month after, well, now you've got like a pattern, and go ahead and adjust the programming so that when that week rolls around the next month, you don't feel like, oh, I crapped out. I couldn't. We don't
think about that. We don't really think about that at all. And I think many of us just have to, if we can become more in tune with our bodies, and women tend to be way more in tune with their bodies than men, which is frustrating when you go to a doctor and what's going on yourself, and they're very dismissive of you. and yes, sometimes it can be in our heads, but it's okay if it's in our heads, right? In our heads affects our body. So our mental state will affect our physical state, right? We talked about that last time with in regards to mental health with Fred. So it's, we're very in tune with like what's happening to ourselves. And the more in tune you are, the easier it is for you to plan ahead. And that can be for any kind of exercise. I mean, we talk about, obviously our goal here is strength training, but anything you do, your running, your tennis game, whatever it is that you're doing, your yoga, make a note. I think keeping track of your daily exercise is as important as tracking your food if you're a food tracker, right? I love the fact that we track that we log our exercise. I log everything. Even when I'm not doing barbell training, I'm logging it. I'm logging when I'm biking. I'm logging if I'm doing, a month of just kind of kettlebell work. Everything gets tracked because that gives you more feedback for you. And hey, this actually feels good on my body. I'm going to try this for a little bit while, or that felt really bad on my body. I don't want to do that exercise. I mean, how are you going to know if you don't actually physically like write it down and make note and say, let's see where I am, a couple of weeks from now, where I am a month from now. helps to have a coach, of course, because the coach can help you adjust your program as needed. And that's what I did yesterday, with my client. We adjusted her program and she felt good. She finished her session and she didn't feel bad that she didn't make her lift. She already knew going into it. She's like, I just can't do this today. I feel really, really weak. What's going on? Well, this is what's going on. So it's important to definitely step back and assess yourself and what's going on, and reach out to people for help, as needed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that? This is great, Rebecca.
There was all the stuff there are so many.
Yeah. We can do it too.
Like if you're looking for good resources, anything that you find on Instagram or YouTube, that's Sarah Duvall, and her business is CES, Core Exercise Solutions. Anything that you find that she puts out is really good, and has that focus on pelvic floor health. And she's also, keyed into the idea of progressively building strength, which is, of course, a key tenet of what we do.
Absolutely.
She's worked with, she's not a person who's going to tell someone, oh, you can't deadlift, avoid barbells. She's not one of those people at all. So she's got a lot of really good material out there, starting at, breathing and building awareness about even firing of core muscles and things like that. And then, integrating that upward into exercises and adding weight to those exercises.
How'd you find her?
I don't remember. I think I went down a wormhole.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get the information from Rebecca, and I will have her name and links to her website and information about her and from her in our show notes. So if you want to take a look at that, and I'll have a couple other links to some articles that would be good. Just more information. The more information you have, the better. And then you can find kind of like, hey, this really speaks more to what my issue is. But I'll get that from you, Rebecca, and we'll put that in the show notes. If you've got questions about anything that we've talked today about, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And we could always do a part 2 on this subject if there are things that you would like us to discuss that we didn't discuss. And we'll do our best to answer those questions. You can always reach me at Emily@5by3.com and Rebecca at
cornerstonestrengthmaryland@gmail.com.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast today. I definitely enjoyed learning more about this. Rebecca, this is fantastic. And a lot of it was good reinforcement for me as far as like what I tell my clients in regards to breathing, because I know there's been a lot of, over the years, more and more, I think, focus on breathing and correct way to breathe. And I think you can go down a real rabbit hole with that. So just having this information, I think, it breaks it down really, really nicely, and makes people more aware of, what's actually happening when we take a breath. So we hope you enjoy it today, and we look forward to being back in a couple weeks with our next podcast. Happy New Year to everybody, because we are in 2024 now, and we hope that you have a very wonderful week and New Year. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rebecca.
Sweet. Take care.
We'll be back soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to 5by3 Radio with Emily and Rebecca. If you like our show and want to know more about 5by3 training, please visit us at www.5, that's F-I-V-E, the letter X, the number 3.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. To learn more about Rebecca, please visit her website, cornerstonestrengthmaryland.com. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.